There is a silence in the historical record that nobody wants to explain. Not NASA, not the White House, not the aerospace contractors who built the machines that carried 12 human beings to the surface of another world. The silence is not the absence of information. The information exists. The documents exist. The testimonies exist. The silence is something more deliberate than that. It is the silence of an institution that answered one question and then, quietly and without ceremony, decided that the next question was not worth asking. The question that nobody answered was simple. We went to the moon. We proved it was possible. We built the rockets, trained the astronauts, solved the engineering problems that every expert said were unsolvable, and we put human footprints on a world that had never known a footprint before. And then, without drama, without crisis, without a single catastrophic failure that would have justified the decision, we stopped going. And we have not gone back since. Not once. Not in 54 years. That silence is the story, and the story is more complicated, more political, more human, and ultimately more troubling than anything official sources have ever been willing to say directly. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to 1969, when Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. You have to go back to 1961, to a specific political moment that most people have never examined carefully, because if you examine it carefully, it completely reframes everything that came after. In April of 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to reach outer space. He orbited the Earth once and landed safely. The achievement was extraordinary by any measure. But for the United States government, it was not primarily a scientific event. It was a humiliation. The most powerful country on Earth had just been beaten to the most visible technological frontier in human history by its ideological enemy. And within weeks of Gagarin's flight, President John F. Kennedy was sitting in meetings trying to figure out how to respond. The internal discussions from this period are available in the historical record, and what they reveal is illuminating. Kennedy asked his advisors directly, "Is there any space project we could undertake that we could actually win?" Not which project was most scientifically valuable, not which project would contribute most to human knowledge. Which project could America win? The answer that came back was the moon. The moon was far enough away and difficult enough to reach that neither nation had yet achieved it. And if the timeline was set aggressively enough, within a decade, America might be able to get there before the Soviets could mount a serious challenge. This is what Kennedy stood up before Congress and declared in May of 1961. We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The speech is remembered as one of the great inspirational declarations in modern history. And it was. But it was also a calculated geopolitical gambit made by a president who, by his own private admission recorded in White House tapes from 1962, was primarily interested in space as a tool of competition rather than exploration. In those recordings, Kennedy told NASA Administrator James Webb directly that the moon program's value was entirely wrapped in the competition with the Soviet Union. Strip that competition away, Kennedy said, and he would not have the same level of interest in the program at all. Read that again. The man who inspired a generation to look at the stars was privately treating the greatest exploration program in human history as a chess piece. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because Kennedy's instrumental view of the moon program was not unique to him. It was, in fact, the foundational reality of Apollo from beginning to end. Apollo was never designed as a program of sustained exploration. It was designed as a demonstration. A single, spectacular, undeniable demonstration of American technological capability, staged for a global audience during the most dangerous ideological competition the world had ever seen. The goal was not to establish a permanent human presence on the moon. The goal was to get there first and let the whole world see it happen. This distinction between demonstration and exploration, between sprint and sustained presence, is the single most important key to understanding everything that followed. Because when you design a program as a demonstration, you build it to achieve one specific outcome, and when that outcome is achieved, the program has fulfilled its purpose. There is no institutional momentum built into a demonstration. There is no infrastructure of intent designed to carry you beyond the finish line. You cross the line, you win, and then you face a question the program was never designed to answer. Now what? Apollo crossed the line on July 20th, 1969. And the question landed with a weight that nobody in Washington was prepared to carry. Because by that point, the political context had already shifted. The Soviet lunar program, which had been secretly racing America the entire time, developing its own massive N-1 moon rocket and training its own cosmonauts for a lunar mission, had quietly collapsed. The N-1 rocket exploded 4 times in testing, including one explosion that was, at the time, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history, destroying an entire launch pad. The Soviet program never flew a cosmonaut to the moon, and with the Soviet threat to reach the moon first effectively eliminated, the primary justification for Apollo's extraordinary expense evaporated. The race was over. There was no more opponent. And without an opponent, the political will to sustain the program began to bleed away almost immediately. What most people are not seeing is how quickly this happened. Apollo 11 landed in July 1969. By January 1970, less than 6 months later, NASA had already been forced to cancel Apollo 20, not because anything had gone wrong, not because the technology had failed, because the budget was being cut, and the political leadership had decided that the demonstration was complete. The Soviet Union had lost. The point had been made. Why spend billions more to make the same point again? In September of the same year, 2 more missions were canceled. The mission that had been designated Apollo 15 and the mission designated Apollo 19 were both eliminated from the schedule. The remaining missions were renumbered, and what had originally been planned as a 10-landing program was compressed to 6. Even as the astronauts were walking on the moon, even as Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan were driving the lunar rover across the Taurus-Littrow Valley in December of 1972, the infrastructure supporting future missions was already being dismantled. The Saturn V production line had been shut down. The engineers who had spent a decade learning to build the most powerful rocket ever flown were being laid off. The institutional knowledge of Apollo was dissolving in real time, even while Apollo was still happening. Think about what that means structurally. It means the end of Apollo was not a decision made in 1972 when Apollo 17 splashed down. It was a decision made in 1969 and 1970 while the program was still flying. The missions that followed Apollo 11, all 5 successful subsequent landings, were executed against a backdrop of institutional shutdown. The people flying those missions knew that the program behind them was being dismantled. The scientists receiving the data knew that the missions sending that data would soon stop forever. Apollo's final years were lived in the shadow of its own cancellation. And here is something that the official narrative almost never confronts honestly. The scientific case for continuing was overwhelming. Every subsequent Apollo mission was more scientifically productive than the one before it. The geological sophistication of the crews was increasing. The instruments being deployed were more precise. The landing sites were more varied and more geologically interesting. Scientists who worked on the program have stated consistently for decades that the data from Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 alone raised more questions than they answered, and that answering those questions would have required precisely the kind of continued missions that were being canceled even as those missions were flying. The 3 missions that were cut entirely, 18, 19, and 20, had been targeted at some of the most scientifically compelling terrain on the entire lunar surface. Copernicus Crater, Tycho Crater, sites that planetary scientists had identified as potentially capable of revealing fundamental information about the early history of the solar system. The rocks that would have been collected from those sites, the seismic data that would have been gathered, the surveys that would have been conducted, all of it lost. Not because the missions were impossible, not because the technology had failed, because the program had served its political purpose and the political will to sustain it had evaporated. And this is where something genuinely uncomfortable enters the story. Because the gap between the scientific value of what was being discovered and the political decision to stop discovering it is not a gap that budget math alone can explain. The Apollo program, at its peak, consumed roughly 4% of the entire federal budget. By the time the final missions were flying, the figure had already dropped significantly. The cost of flying the remaining 3 canceled missions, against the backdrop of what America was already spending, was not the decisive factor that official histories imply it was. Something else was driving the decision. And the most honest answer is that what was driving it was the complete absence of any political constituency demanding that exploration continue. The Vietnam War was consuming the country's attention and its federal budget simultaneously. The Nixon administration, which had inherited Apollo from Kennedy and Johnson, had no personal investment in its continuation. Nixon himself had reportedly been disturbed by the near disaster of Apollo 13 in 1970, when an oxygen tank explosion crippled the spacecraft and nearly killed 3 astronauts, and the possibility of a catastrophic loss of crew on live television was something his advisors wanted to avoid at almost any cost. Beyond the safety concern, Nixon's White House had its own space ambitions, centered on the Space Shuttle program, which Nixon formally approved in 1972. And those ambitions required redirecting NASA's resources away from the moon and toward a reusable, low-Earth orbit transportation system. The Space Shuttle was presented publicly as the future of spaceflight, a vehicle so advanced and so efficient that it would make access to space routine and affordable. In practice, it became something quite different. It became a machine that never left the protective shell of Earth's magnetic field. For 30 years, from 1981 to 2011, the shuttle flew 135 missions, and every single one of them took place within approximately 600 kilometers of Earth's surface. Every single mission was conducted within a radiation environment largely shielded by Earth's magnetosphere. Not one shuttle astronaut ever passed through the Van Allen belts. Not one shuttle mission aimed a nose toward the moon. This is not a criticism of the shuttle as an engineering achievement. It was a remarkable machine that built the International Space Station and serviced the Hubble Space Telescope and carried more scientific experiments to orbit than any previous vehicle in history. But as a successor to Apollo's ambition, it was a retreat. A sophisticated, expensive, Nobel Prize-winning retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. The decision to build the shuttle instead of continuing lunar exploration was the decision that sealed humanity's absence from the moon for the following half-century. But here is where it gets worse. Because the retreat was not just strategic. It was structural. It was physical. When Apollo ended and the shuttle era began, NASA did not carefully preserve the institutional knowledge that had made Apollo possible. The engineers who knew how to build Saturn V rockets, who had spent years developing the specific manufacturing techniques, the specific metallurgical processes, the specific welding methods that the rockets required, those engineers retired. And their knowledge retired with them. The documentation existed. The blueprints existed, but the tacit knowledge, the kind of understanding that only comes from having actually built the thing with your own hands, having watched it fail and corrected the failure and tried again, that knowledge was not transferable through documents alone. When NASA later began working on the Space Launch System rocket for the Artemis program, engineers encountered a stunning discovery. Certain manufacturing techniques that had been considered routine during the Apollo era were essentially impossible to replicate with the current workforce. Specific alloys had gone out of production. Specific suppliers no longer existed. Specific expertise had retired and never been replaced. An entire generation of industrial capability had been allowed to atrophy, and rebuilding it from the ground up was costing more money and more time than anyone had publicly anticipated. According to informed sources within the aerospace engineering community, the loss of institutional knowledge from Apollo represents one of the most significant self-inflicted wounds in the history of American science and technology. Not because the knowledge could not eventually be rebuilt. It could, and it is being rebuilt, but because the cost of rebuilding it, in time and money and national capability, is extraordinary. The simplest summary is brutal in its clarity. We forgot how to go to the moon. Not theoretically, practically. We allowed the specific, hard-won, irreplaceable human expertise that made Apollo possible to dissolve as if it were something ordinary. It was not ordinary. It was the product of 10 years of the most intensive engineering effort in the history of industrial civilization. And now we are paying the price of that forgetting in the form of the Artemis program, which has become the single most expensive and most delayed human spaceflight program since Apollo itself. A 2021 audit from NASA's independent inspector general projected total Artemis costs through fiscal year 2025 at approximately $93 billion. Each launch of the Space Launch System is estimated at roughly $4.1 billion. The spacesuits required for a lunar landing do not yet exist in flight-ready form. NASA's Office of Inspector General has suggested that new spacesuit demonstrations might not be completed until 2031. The lunar lander, being developed by SpaceX using the Starship vehicle, still needs to demonstrate in-orbit refueling operations, a process that has never been attempted and that carries its own timeline of uncertainty. The congressional watchdog Government Accountability Office has assessed only a 70% probability that the lander will be ready for a 2028 lunar landing. And even that estimate is being treated with skepticism within the technical community. Meanwhile, the White House proposed in its 2027 budget request to cut NASA's overall budget by 23% and its science budget by an almost incomprehensible 47%. Artemis has already seen thousands of NASA employees cut as part of broader government reduction efforts. The very agency being asked to lead humanity's return to the moon is simultaneously being asked to function with dramatically reduced resources, reduced workforce, and reduced institutional stability. And layered across all of this financial and technical turbulence is the geopolitical pressure that is now the true engine driving the American lunar return in a way that is almost perfectly mirrored to what drove Apollo in 1961. China's space program has been executing a systematic, disciplined lunar exploration campaign for more than a decade. Chinese robotic missions have mapped the lunar surface, returned samples, and, in an achievement that no other nation had previously accomplished, landed on the far side of the moon, the hemisphere that perpetually faces away from Earth and had never been directly explored before. China has publicly declared its intention to land taikonauts on the moon by 2030. Chinese engineers are developing the rockets, the landers, and the surface systems required to make that happen. What most people are not seeing is what the race to the moon's south pole is actually about. It is not primarily scientific. The lunar South Pole contains confirmed deposits of water ice, preserved in permanently shadowed craters that have not seen sunlight in billions of years. Multiple robotic missions, using orbital spectrometry and direct impact analysis, have confirmed the presence of this water ice beyond reasonable scientific doubt. And water ice on the moon is not just geologically interesting. Water can be split by electrolysis into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen are rocket propellant. A nation that establishes infrastructure at the lunar South Pole capable of processing water ice into rocket fuel possesses something extraordinary. A refueling depot at the edge of the inner solar system, capable of supporting missions to Mars and beyond at a fraction of the cost of launching all propellant from Earth's deep gravity well. This is what is actually being competed for. Not a flag, not prestige, though prestige matters. A strategic resource position that could define the economics of spaceflight for the next century. The nation that controls the infrastructure on the lunar surface, particularly around the South Pole water ice deposits, controls something that functions as a port at the edge of human civilization. In December of 2025, President Trump signed an executive order explicitly framing American space activity in terms of national superiority and strategic resource access. In March of 2026, NASA formally sidelined its Lunar Gateway project, the orbital space station that had been intended as a waypoint for lunar surface missions, and redirected its focus toward building surface infrastructure directly. The strategy is being rewritten in real time because the competitive pressure is intensifying in real time. Artemis II, the crewed flight that looped around the moon and returned to Earth, completed in April of 2026, the first time humans had traveled beyond low Earth orbit since Apollo 17 in 1972. 4 astronauts went. They named their capsule Integrity. They came home safely, and the clock toward the next confrontation between American and Chinese ambitions on the lunar surface is ticking louder with every passing month. What nobody in any official channel is saying directly is the depth of the irony embedded in this moment. We abandoned the moon because we won the first race. We are returning to the moon because we are afraid of losing the second one. The motivating force has not changed in 65 years. It is not science. It is not exploration for its own sake. It is competition. It is the same geopolitical anxiety that launched Apollo in 1961, dressed in new clothes and pointed at a new rival. And the danger of that, the deep structural danger, is that competition produces the same kind of program that competition produced before. It produces programs designed to achieve a visible, dramatic, politically legible outcome on a specific timeline. It does not naturally produce programs designed for the slow, expensive, unglamorous work of establishing genuine, sustained presence. Apollo showed us what a competition-driven program looks like at its most spectacular. 12 people on the moon, 382 kilograms of samples, seismometers still transmitting data years after the astronauts left. And then, nothing. 54 years of nothing. Because the competition ended and the will evaporated and the institutional knowledge dissolved. If Artemis succeeds, if humans stand on the moon again, on the South Pole in 2027 or 2028 or 2029, the question that will matter more than any other is what comes the day after the landing. Not the speech, not the footage, not the global headlines. What comes the next year, and the year after that, and the decade after that. Whether the landing becomes the beginning of something permanent, or whether it becomes the peak of something temporary. Whether this time, with everything we know about what happened last time, we make the decision that was never truly made in 1969, to treat the moon not as a destination to conquer, but as a world to inhabit. The engineers are working. The rockets are being tested, the spacesuits are being redesigned, the lunar landers are being built. The political will, driven by competition and national anxiety, is generating money and urgency in roughly the quantities required. All of that is real. All of that represents genuine progress toward a genuine return. But progress toward a destination is not the same as a commitment to what lies beyond the destination. And the history of the last 54 years is not primarily the history of a technical failure. It is the history of a commitment that was never made. A decision to treat the moon as a finish line rather than a starting point, and to walk away the moment the race was won. The moon has not changed. It hangs in the sky every night, reflecting the same sunlight it has reflected for 4 billion years, indifferent to the political calculations of the small civilization on the blue planet below. It does not notice our ambitions. It does not register our delays. It does not keep score. But we do. And somewhere in the arithmetic of what we have spent, what we have lost, what we have forgotten, and what we are now spending enormous treasure to remember, somewhere in that arithmetic is an answer to the question of who we are as a species. Whether we are the kind of civilization that reaches beyond itself and stays there, or the kind that reaches, touches, retreats, and then spends decades arguing about whether it was worth it. The next human being to stand on the moon has probably already been born, may have already been selected, maybe training right now, learning the geology of a surface their predecessors visited once and then abandoned. What that person does after they take those first steps, whether they are the first of many or the last for another generation, will be determined not by engineering but by will. By the willingness of a civilization to decide, once and for all, that the silence has been long enough. That decision has not yet been made. The silence is not yet over, and the moon is still waiting.